It was one of those warm afternoons where the world feels slower, like it's holding its breath in the best way. The kind of day where the smell of fresh-cut grass drifts in from down the block and the only real sound in your own backyard is the lazy hum of bees. Walter Harris was crouched low in the middle of his vegetable garden, turning over the leaves of his collard greens with hands that had been working this soil for 40 years. He was 78 now, thin but wiry silver hair catching the sunlight. That little patch of earth behind his house in Willow Bend was more than just food on the table, it was his sanctuary. Folks round here knew it too. That's why it felt so wrong when the crunch of heavy boots broke the peace. Walter straightened, leaning on his spade, and saw a man stepping through the back gate like he owned the place. A white cop, tall, broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes. He didn't knock, didn't even nod, just stopped in the middle of the path and said flat as a statement, "Need to check out some suspicious activity." "Got a report." Walter blinked at him. "Report about what?" The man's gaze swept the garden like it was a crime scene. "Won't know till I take a look." "No warrant?" Walter asked, his voice calm but with an edge. "Don't need one," the cop replied, stepping closer until his shadow touched Walter's boots. "Cause is whatever I say it is." There was a pause there, heavy like the air between two storm clouds about to collide. Walter shook his head slowly. "Not here. This is my land. You don't have cause." That's when the man muttered something under his breath. Ugly old poison Walter had heard too many times. And just like that, the air shifted. The shove came out of nowhere, knocking Walter sideways into his greens, snapping stems he'd grown from seed. Dirt clung to his shirt as he pushed himself up, still holding his ground. "You need to leave," he said low and steady. Instead, the cop's hand went to his baton. The swing was practiced almost casual, and it landed with a dull, sickening thud against Walter's head. The garden spun, the sunlight fractured, and he went down in the dirt he'd loved. The cop stood over him for a second, breathing hard, then hooked the baton back into its loop like he was done pulling weeds. He left through the gate without looking back. By the time Walter's grandson, Chris Harris, came home from the hardware store with seed packets and new gloves, the yard was silent. Too silent. Through the fence slats, Chris saw a man in uniform standing over something on the ground. The paper bag slid from his hand, spilling seeds onto the path, and he stepped closer. It wasn't until the angle shifted that the truth slammed into him. His grandfather crumpled in the greens, one hand curled in the soil. "What happened?" Chris asked, but it barely came out as a whisper. The cop glanced at him, eyes hidden behind glass. "Resisted inspection," he said, like he was reading off a form. Chris knelt, fingers pressing to the side of Walter's neck, already knowing what he wouldn't find. From somewhere nearby, a neighbor shouted, "I'm recording this." The officer turned his body away from the lens. Chris didn't even register it. His eyes stayed on the stillness in his grandfather's face. Finally, he looked up, his voice steady in a way that made the air go tight. "You killed him." The cop shrugged, muttered something into his radio, and walked out the gate. That night, Chris sat alone in the kitchen, the single bulb casting a tired yellow over the table. Walter's gloves sat in the center, still dusted with soil. Outside the garden was bathed in moonlight, the rows quiet except for the old oak swaying at the back fence. His eyes drifted to the corner where the shovel leaned against the wall. He'd sharpened it last week for planting. Tonight, it had a different weight in his mind. By morning, the decision was set. Chris found the cop leaning against his cruiser a few blocks away, sipping coffee. "Something happened in the garden last night," Chris said evenly. "Damage you might want to see." The cop smirked. And you're inviting me back. That's a surprise. Chris didn't bite. See for yourself. They walked in silence, Chris half a step ahead, the rhythm of their boots crunching on the pavement. In the backyard, Chris led him toward the far corner where he'd turned over a patch of soil. The cop crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt. Looks fresh. Someone's been here. Chris's eyes fixed on the back of the man's neck, the short hairline, the steady rise and fall of his shoulders. He could hear his own breathing over the soft rustle of the oak leaves. You should have called this in, the cop muttered. Chris stepped closer, his hand curling around the shovel's handle. The grain of the wood felt rough but certain. The swing was clean, precise, born not from rage but from the kind of certainty that lives in your bones when you've already played the moment out in your head 100 times. The blade hit with a solid final thud. The cop collapsed forward into the soil, hands splaying across the ground like he might catch himself. But there was nothing to catch. Chris checked for a pulse, nothing. The garden was silent again. A voice drifted over the fence. I saw him go in, Mr. Jensen from next door said. He didn't look surprised. You're not calling anyone, Chris said. No, Jensen replied. Not for this. Mrs. Ortega from 2 doors down joined him, eyes on the body, then on Chris. Sometimes the garden needs clearing before it can grow again, she said, before disappearing into her yard. No one else came. No one else needed to. Chris dug the hole himself, steady and deliberate, lowering the body into the earth with the same care Walter had used planting beans. When it was done, he tamped the soil, smoothed it, and planted new sprouts over the top. By the time they grew, no one would see what lay beneath except Chris, who would see it every time. The days after moved with an odd rhythm. Neighbors stopped by with bread eggs, jars of honey. No one mentioned the far corner, and Chris never asked for their silence. They gave it freely, like an unspoken pact. Weeks later, the beans were tall and green, curling around their stakes. Chris harvested them one evening, leaving bags on doorsteps up and down the street. The next morning, a jar of homemade jam sat on his porch. No note. None needed. Word of the cop's transfer floated around in whispers. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everyone who mattered knew enough to stop talking. One night, Chris stood at the corner patch, brushing soil from the base of a plant. You're coming along, he murmured. In the breeze, the leaves seemed to nod. He knew justice doesn't always wear a badge or show up in court. Sometimes it grows in the ground you've been trusted to protect. Sometimes it lives in the quiet agreement between people who know what's right, even if they'll never say it out loud. And sometimes when the season turns, you plant something new, right where the weeds used to be, and you make damn sure it grows strong. Now I want to hear from you. Was Chris right to take justice into his own hands? Or does crossing that line make him no better than the man he buried? Drop your thoughts below, because this isn't just a story about a garden. It's about what we're willing to do when the system fails, and what kind of justice we can live with when the gates close behind us.